It is now my pleasure to welcome you to the Making the Family Business Work webcast. I will now turn the webcast over to Jennifer Jolly. Jennifer, you may begin your conference.
Thank you for joining us for our Family Business Services webcast, Making the Family Business Work. Today, we will answer questions to help you prepare for the long-term future of your company, including the pros and cons of keeping a business in your family, key considerations in succession planning, and steps to take when transitioning the business outside your family. We look forward to answering the questions that you submit as well. I'm pleased to introduce our presenters from the Family Business Consulting Group. Dr. Otis Baskin was the founding director of the Family Business Forum at the University of Memphis and is a former dean of Pepperdine University. His primary expertise is in helping business-owning families develop plans for leadership succession, development of next-generation leaders, and family ownership structures. Dana Telford specializes in succession planning, family governance, board effectiveness, and conflict management. He earned an MBA from Harvard Business School and is a third-generation member of a commercial real estate firm. Otis, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good morning, everyone. I'm pleased that you could join us today. I'd like to go over some objectives for our conference today to begin. So if we could bring that slide up. One of the most important objectives we have is provide some basic understanding of key family business concepts so that you have a good context in which to discuss important issues. We also are going to discuss the challenges and complexities of family business. There certainly are plenty of these, but there are also many reasons why family businesses are very successful. So we're going to look at key components then of succession planning, which is one of the primary issues facing all family businesses at any stage and is a continuing need for all businesses. And then we want to give you some tools and resources for family business discussions, ways that you can work with your family and your business to begin the important discussions that you need to have for continuing success. And we also want to highlight the benefits of working in and owning a family business. So you have that very clear understanding of the strength of family business. If you're part of a family business, and as part of a family business, you need to know that you are in very good company. In the United States, some 22 million companies. Of those 22 million, 92% are family controlled in some way. The United States actually is larger even than Europe in terms of the percentage of businesses that are family controlled. 49% of our gross domestic product comes from family business. 59% of our workforce. 78% of new jobs created are created by family businesses. And it may surprise you to learn that 60% of all publicly traded companies are in fact family-controlled companies. There are a number of great examples of these, such as Ford Motor Company, the New York Times, and many, many others. And 37% of the Fortune 500, the largest, most successful companies in the United States, are in fact family companies. When we get to Latin America, Europe, and Asia and look at the rest of the world combined, we're dealing almost exclusively with family-owned businesses. So with that understanding, not only then is family business the most prevalent mode of business ownership in the world today, it has always been, of course, the most prevalent form of business ownership, but it's also the most successful. And while the printing on this slide may be a little more difficult to read in this format, let me simply tell you what it says. This is a report and a study done by McKinsey Consulting that finds that family businesses have less leverage and carry a lower cost of debt than their publicly traded counterparts. And this slide takes a 10-year slice showing that family businesses always, no matter what the economic conditions prevailing at any given time, were better performers than purely publicly traded businesses in terms of lower cost of debt and less leverage. And then as we move on to the next slide, we see that family business strength continues. This slide shows us that the strength of family business apply across industries. Family businesses are the blue dots here, and we see that family business returns to shareholders in the United States and in Western Europe, again, over more than a decade, always outperform their publicly traded counterparts in every industry that was surveyed, except for two very small. So family businesses have great strength. They perform well. It's an excellent business ownership model. And yet, there are many questions about family business. I want us to look at the competitive advantages they have. Why are they so strong? First of all, there's a unique and compelling culture in every family business. It comes from that family. It comes from the values that that family possesses. It comes from the values that they use in their business, and it also comes through the culture of the companies they create. Family businesses are able to take long-term decisions, where publicly traded companies are often under the pressure to create something within simply a quarter or even a month's time. Family businesses look forward for generations and provide long-term sustainability in their decision-making. This leads them to unconventional strategies. They often do things that others are very surprised. And I'll give you an example of an unconventional strategy that has had true strength for a family business. We all know that going through this last recession, the most successful car company in the world was Ford Motor Company. But think about how Ford went through this. First of all, at the beginning of the recession, their CEO, Alan Mulally, announced to the world that they were going to build a huge cash reserve. They were going to do this by borrowing as much money as they could before the financial markets shut down and selling off some of their more prized assets like Jaguar. People thought this was a very strange approach indeed, and certainly it was not the approach taken at General Motors or Chrysler. But Mulally was able to go to the Ford family by going to the chairman of the board, Bill Ford, and have him take this to his family members who have voting control at Ford and sell them on this strategy. And so when Alan Mulally announced that strategy to Wall Street analysts, he basically said, this is what we're going to do. It's going to take a long time. I'm not going to be giving guidance, but we'll let you know when we come out of it. Well, Wall Street was incensed. There was an uproar. The stock price fell for a while. But Ford Motor Company consistently gained strength and gained market share as this recession went on. And they came out of it much stronger, and their share price grew substantially as a result. So that's an example of the unconventional strategies family businesses have because they can take those long-term decisions. There's also a unique management and ownership harmony that can be demonstrated in a family business. Mulally, as a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, was able to go to the family members that had controlling ownership, explain his plan, get agreement, and therefore able to stick to the plan until it was successful. That's what made this really possible. Family businesses can know who their owners are and can create that kind of harmony between management and ownership. And also, family businesses operate for a purpose beyond just financial reward. That's not to say financial rewards aren't important to success, but there is a purpose beyond that that is deep within the culture of the family that makes these businesses so successful. It's who they are and why they are in business after all. But there certainly is enough out there to worry all family business owners and managers. And we've all heard the saying, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. It's a very frightening aspect of family business. And the data back this up. You can see from this chart that as a family business moves from its founding to second generation ownership, just over 30% survive into that transition. And moving from second generation to third generation, less than 20%, more like about 15% actually survive that transition. And by the 4th generation, only about 10% remain. Why? What makes this true? Well, one uncomfortable question remains, is this prevailing tendency to look to the oldest male in the family to step up to leadership part of that problem? That is, are people who aren't ready for leadership suddenly thrust into the position where they are destined to fail? Do families sometimes pass over better qualified people because they have a long-standing preference for the oldest male? That's true around the world, but I think it's becoming less true. The issue really is that there needs to be a much more carefully planned process for selecting next generation leadership. This needs to be done with great care. But too often, I'm afraid, this cartoon illustrates how family business succession may occur, with fathers saying, go on kids, let fate decide who will take over, because no parent is comfortable choosing among their children. And then this very qualified young woman at the end of the line saying, if I had known this, I would have never bothered getting 3 MBAs. I've seen it too often in my career. But the issue really is not deciding to choose one child or the other. It's deciding who can best lead the company for the benefit of all. And sometimes that even is someone outside the company, at least for a transition period. So let's move on and look at the dynamics that exist within a family and their business. Dana, why don't you begin for us?
Thanks, Otis. This is Dana Telford speaking. So Otis has spent some good time here talking about how successful family businesses can be, how returns can exceed those of non-family businesses, but also has started to clarify that this is not an easy set of circumstances to make sense of. And I want to take a second and talk through what we call and what professionals in our area of expertise call the 3-circle model of family business, a model that was developed a number of years ago by John Davis and Renato Tajuri that represents what one of my clients called a number of years ago a very strange dance, he said. When I described to him my work and the complexities in dealing with owners and family members and key executives in a family business, he said, you're dealing with a strange dance. And he said it's akin to a slow dance on a cruise ship on heavy seas is what he said. I thought that was an interesting use of an analogy. But 3 different groups of people come together to form a family business. And if we think carefully for a minute about the different goals and the different propensities, the different kind of circumstances in these 3 different organizations, I think it's easier to understand why this can be so difficult to make this system successful. Owners of capital, if you look at that top circle, have risk involved. They've put their money either directly or indirectly towards an entrepreneurial idea, and they have very empirical, very financially driven motivations, right? They invest money into something and want to see that money returned, and they'd like to see a return on top of that money at some point. Well, sometimes those owners aren't the right people to manage their assets and operate their businesses, so they'll go out and hire key executives. And those executives, if you think about their motivations, are quite similar to the owners. They are financially driven, want to have some sense of security, want to be paid fairly for their time and their knowledge, and probably at the end of the day would like to have a little bit more control and a little bit more reward for the time and for the expertise that they're bringing to the game. So again, fairly similar sets of drivers. If we then add to that mix a group of family members who come from an organization that's very emotionally driven, really wonderful, right? It kind of circles around the notions of harmony and love and peace and security also. We now have more of an emotional driver and an emotional input into this system that up until this point is fairly empirical and fairly what some would call rational, although I don't know if that's the fairest term to use. When we put them all together, and you're sitting there thinking, this sounds very familiar to me, you create a complex system of 7 different roles of people: owners, employees, family members, family owners, and then those who are right in the middle, if you see that number 7, the family owner managers, those of you who are in the middle of this perfect storm trying to keep everyone happy, trying to keep the owners happy with a return on their capital and a growing business, and the executives well compensated and family members feeling secure. It is a tough, tough situation. Some ideas about making sense of these 7 roles, because many of us have one of these 7 roles at any time of the day, right? Potentially we're thinking through different scenarios from different perspectives. And our perspectives are important, right? So we see the world from one of these 7 different positions, and our perspectives are different, and we have influence on this system more than expected in some cases. For instance, some of you have heard of the Pritzker family, which is the family that owns the Hyatt hotel chain. The Pritzker family went through a very well-known, very well-documented debacle related to shareholder and family relationships, where there was a lawsuit actually filed by a daughter against her father for mismanagement of a trust and for a breach of fiduciary responsibility. And I'm not an employee of, nor have I been a consultant to the Pritzker family. This is all public information. We take confidentiality very seriously. But the end result of this family feud related to trust and beneficiary relationships was a $1 billion lawsuit by a daughter against her estranged father that was also the product of a divorced relationship. And that problem was settled for $500 million, assets that came out of the operating business. So one mistake that can be made by family business owners and executives is assuming that those folks in number 5 there, the family members, who don't have an operating role in the company and don't have direct ownership, that they will not influence the success of the business, nor will they influence or affect the balance sheet of the business. All of these relationships need to be managed in a careful way. Not easy to do at all. What this can create, if we now kind of go to a little bit simpler assumption, and that is that a family is an organization different than a business, we can start to understand more about how an injection of emotion into this system can potentially influence the way that we make decisions together in this system. So let's start again with looking at one of these organizations individually. The family. Like it or not, we're all socialists at home, right? If we go back to our days of political science class in the university or reading of books about political systems, Karl Marx called communism or socialism. The motto was, from each according to his ability, to each according to their need. So if we bring home money to our families as wage earners, the socialistic model that we follow says we don't get to basically spend all that money. We instead look at the family as an organization, say where is the greatest need? Is there a medical need? Is there an educational need or opportunity? Are there costs that we need to cover? And then resources are allocated towards those needs. What does that mean? Families are also very relationship driven, right? They're qualitative in nature, that we focus a lot on kind of the ethereal parts of objectives and talk about love again and harmony and peace and joy and quiet and charity and security. And our relationships, if we think about them also, are involuntary, right? I mean, we really choose one person in our family, and that's the person that we choose to marry or have a long-term relationship with. Everybody else really just shows up, right, with in-laws and kids. We choose to have kids, but we don't have a lot to say about their personalities when it comes right down to it. And those relationships are very permanent. Even in a situation where there's static relationship or where there's a lot of static in a relationship, we still have there's a permanency about family relationships that make them tough. Now if we compare that to a business where so much of the world of capitalism is focused on return on invested capital and what are we creating in terms of value, and where the metrics are very much based on merit, right? Well, if you want resources, you've got to create value. You've got to create results, and those results are very quantitative. They're very empirical. The relationships inside of these organizations are voluntary. If I don't like my relationships with my employer or other employees, I can choose to go somewhere else. If my employer doesn't like my value that I've created and feels like there's a better alternative, I'll be let go. Everybody understands this, and because of that, it's temporary. So if we smash these two organizations together, and even in a worst-case scenario, if family members bring kind of a royal mentality and a socialistic mentality into the family business, we have a real problem. And that can create this emotional response where our brains start to change the way that it processes information and makes decisions. And there's a number of economics professors and studies that have been done that show that when we get emotion injected into our brain and when at the same time we're making decisions about money and value, we tend to be less rational and less reasonable when we have kind of a high emotional response that's involved in that. So a lot of what guys like Otis and I and our colleagues and family advisors around the world do is try to help to create structures and systems that are predictable, that can keep too much emotion out of these systems. Now, if we make an assumption here in family business discussion, and that is that there's a goal that you're either considering or that you've decided to pass your business in some form to members of your family, right? That might mean that you sell the business and pass assets, liquid assets, or more permanent assets to your family, or that you take an operating business and that you're passing that on to your children, or you're passing it from your sibling generation onto a cousin group, or even from a cousin group to a group of second cousins. How do you do that? Well, over time, we've come up with different models of steps to take and key elements of effective succession planning. And here are 10 must-haves, as we would call them, for excellent succession planning. Now, there's a danger in this slide that I'm very well aware of, and that is that I could spend the next 2 hours talking about the intricacies of this. So I'd like to invite you, if you have a particular question about one of these 10, to send them in and we'll talk about them here in the last 10 minutes of our time together. But I'll roll through them pretty quickly because there's other information we want to get to. The first thing that this starts with is an owner's personal financial plan. All right, if you own your business and you want to pass it along to your kids, you're not going to do anything until you know that you have security and that your financial needs are going to be taken care of in the future. And no children out there want their parents to feel as though there isn't a great reward for the value they've created in their business. So it starts with saying, how much money do I really need on a monthly basis? How much money do I need in an account somewhere that will make me feel like I can go through a transition process that doesn't create a real insecurity for me and for my spouse? The second question is more around how do I want to be remembered, right? We like to ask the question, what's the first thing that you want your kids and grandchildren to think about when they hear your name in the future? Is it related to entrepreneurship? Is it related to a foundation? Is it related to physical health? Is it related to a spiritual goal? Is it related to teaching children? Is it related to money and wealth? That's a very important question because so much of this stems from the question of legacy. And then third, a commitment to specific retirement style. So there's a slide coming up about that here in a little bit that I'll get into. And then fourth, what are we really talking about? If we have assets that we've created, what are they worth? Taking into consideration tax valuations versus market valuations and using some combination of those two to create a negotiation with the purchasor or the beneficiaries of this succession plan. But we really need to know, what are we talking about? How much money are we talking about? What kind of assets are we talking about? And then the next question is around who's going to lead in the next generation? Who are going to be the owners that lead the ownership circle? Who are going to be the managers and family key executives that are going to lead the operations of this business? Sixth is around the notion of getting objective outside advice, and that's based on a fundamental question, which is, as parents, can we really objectively judge our children's professionalism and their skill sets and their expertise? There are strong arguments that say we can't. We either overestimate their abilities or we criticize them too much because of this kind of ongoing storyline that's in our head about the development of their lives. So either way, we're really not fair with our kids when we think about their development, and we need outside objective advice. The next, number 7 now is, what is it that the next generation of leaders need to be able to do well? And that's a more important question than who is the person that's going to lead in the next generation. First, we need to understand what is it that they have to do very well, and then we can start to think about who is potentially the right person or group of people to protect this golden goose, so to speak, and to protect this really terrific business and take it into the next generation. Number 8, some well-thought-out legal agreements, right? Buy-sell agreements and operating agreements with contingency planning in them about what happens if divorce, if someone is has an untimely death or becomes incapacitated. We need to think through those. And then once we get to that point, we can start to say, what's the timeline? If I'm going to retire, when am I willing to say that I'm going to retire? When am I willing to put a stake in the ground and say, on this date, I'm no longer going to be in charge? And then from that stake in the ground to start to backwards integrate the timeline and say, okay, if that's 3 years from now, we've got 3 years of evaluation, choice, integrating a new leadership model, and then me letting go. There's also a timeline in there about if I retire from operations and then I become chairman of the board or I'm on the board, when will I retire from that position also? Because often retiring from the board is closely tied to selling or giving up ownership control in the business. That's a very important consideration. And then finally, how do the next generation members honor the legacy of outgoing leaders? These are very special entities, and you're well aware of this. These are really terrific entities, and honoring the legacy and the accomplishments, in our opinion, is really, really important. There are challenges in succession planning that come up in a consistent way, all right? If we think about the first generation and the second generation and the third generation, and if Otis and I could kind of very quickly roll through the hundreds of different families that we've worked with, we can create this notion of the most predictable challenges that are going to come up, and that helps us to be able to counsel our clients about plans that they can make and things that they can do now to prepare for those. The first generation is very much about entrepreneurship and about a unity of decision making. The controlling owner-founder has this great advantage, and that is that board meetings can take place in his or her own head, and decisions can be made very quickly. When the first generation then passes ownership and management to a next generation, something happens that is very predictable, and that is that now that decision-making model creates a new complexity because there are at least two and maybe more who have rights and interests and responsibilities to be a part of a good decision-making process. And as talented and as successful as the first generation has been, they've never had to go through that. They've never had to integrate with siblings to whom they're very closely tied and make decisions together. The third generation, also predictably, has to deal with the fact that they were raised in different family branches, that differences between siblings who are their parents can kind of migrate into very different opinions about life, business, profitability, growth, risk, family definition, kind of ideological changes in a cousin group. And without some real careful management and some very open communication process, this can create a bee's nest of issues that can surprise families and can debilitate their businesses.
Dana, if I might offer an example that fits with this.
Please.
I had a client that went through a great deal of succession planning. This father had worked hard and built his business into a global enterprise, and it was truly magnificent. Had 4 children that were very qualified, all had MBAs. 2 of his sons worked in the business with him. He spent an entire year on succession planning and did a great job of choosing the right successor. But that next successor, David, ran the company for a year very well. But as the Christmas holidays approached, his wife and children wanted to go visit grandparents in several states away in upstate Wisconsin for the Christmas holidays, but everything was so busy at their factory. They were working double shifts trying to get products out around the world, and he was under a lot of pressure. And he really couldn't commit to a day when he could leave, and his wife, of course, was trying to buy 6 airplane tickets for them and their 4 children to go. So he was having all this pressure at home and at work, and his father is in one day, and he shares this story with his father. His father looks at him and says, "I don't understand your problem. The company airplane is sitting out at the airport. The pilot is on call. Take it. That's what I would do. Don't worry about commercial airlines during this time." And so he does, and they have a great time on their holiday. But when he comes back from the holiday, he has emails from the other 3 siblings. And by the way, all 4 siblings together owned 80% of this company by now. Those 3 siblings said essentially the same thing. When this was Dad's company, it was Dad's airplane. But now it's our company, and it's our airplane, and you owe us money. Well, his father was just so upset that his children would behave that way. And I had to sit the father down and explain that his son, his successor, had something he never had, shareholders. And that made it very different in terms of the leadership required in that family business going forward. The founder never anticipated that. As well, we could understand he wouldn't. And yet that's a reality that all family businesses, if they're successful, have to deal with.
Thank you. That's a great example. And, One of the things that Otis and I remind the next generation about is that, there's ownership legal rights are very real in our country. If I own something, I can do with it what I want. The notion of succession planning is not any kind of a legal notion until the controlling owners decide to make it legal. It's really a moral agreement. When mom and dad say, we're going to pass this to our kids, that's really, it's a nice idea, but it's not a legal responsibility for them to take on. So we tell the next generation that you're heading towards the notion of this sibling partnership that you just described really well, the complexities of it, but there's always the chance that mom and dad might change their mind. And that's a difficult thing for them to kind of wrap their heads around. One of the ways that you can start to talk about retirement, because we hope as you listen to this webinar that you write down and pull out pieces of it that are going to help you start the conversation if you haven't already started it, or that's going to help you take it one step forward if you have already started it. And here's an idea that it's kind of a fun idea as a discussion point in a group of siblings if you own a company together, or in a group of parents and children to talk about this idea of passing it to the next generation. And that is, what's your retirement style? What do you want to commit to as a style of retirement? And the first style of retirement, as defined by a guy named Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, who wrote an article about this, is the monarch. The monarch, as you can glean from the title, is not great with planning, or as others would call it, a dictator, who dies in office, and the retirement happens, unfortunately, when the heart stops beating and you leave the office in a way that you've never left it before. The second is the notion of a general. The general is one who understands that there should be retirement and then retires to great fanfare and rides off over the hill into the sunset, but hears gunshots back over the hill and says to him or herself, I knew they couldn't do this without me, rides back in to save the day, and then has a much more difficult time ever riding back over that hill. The third is the ambassador, one who says, I've served a purpose here. My term is nearly over. I'm going to help the next ambassador take the control in a slow and meticulous and conscientious way, and make sure that when I'm gone that I'm still reachable and that I can still advise about the transition or a particular problem that comes up. And then the last is the governor, who loses the election, hands over the keys to the mansion, and essentially says, don't call me. I'll be in a comfortable place. My cell phone will not be on. You're on your own. It's basically like throwing somebody into the deep end of the pool and saying, you got to figure it out. If you're looking for a discussion starter, this is one. To talk openly, if you're a controlling owner founder, or if you're a sibling owner, with your partners or with your kids, and say, what do you think I am? Do you think I'm the monarch? Do you think I'm the general? And to really, really push for open discussion about this. And then to use it to say, well, however you think I am, this is who I'm going to be. Even if you're going to be the monarch, right, that information would be valuable information for your children to have. When we're talking about creating structure and creating systems that are going to help keep emotion out of these emotionally charged systems, we really are talking about creating predictability. We love predictability as humans, and we spend a lot of time trying to predict the future, whether it's equities markets and commodities markets, the weather, housing prices. We really want to be able to see the future before it happens. And part of creating governance structures and talking through what's going to happen when, or what's going to happen if, is to say we can move through a transition and we can go through a process in the most reasonable, rational way that all of us can work on together. And really, again, part of that is just saying, let's create the expectation that we're going to follow these different rules. For instance, one of the most important policies that we help families create early on is an employment policy. the notion that at some point in the future, some member of the family may come to us and say, I'm so glad we have a family business because I can't get a job anywhere else. The whole thing about college didn't work out for me, so I just need a job, and I'd like to have a pretty high rate, and by the way, I can't work weekends, et cetera, et cetera. Having an employment policy that says, here are the members of the family that we will allow to approach the business for potential employment. They might be folks who have a 4-year college degree if they're looking for a management position. They might need to have a few years outside work experience. Perhaps they need to have been promoted in outside work experience. These kinds of hurdles can really, really help because then when that person shows up and are underqualified and assuming that their blood and DNA is going to get them a great position, much easier to say, you know, we have this policy that all of us worked on and signed off on, and it says, here are the hurdles. Why don't you take it and look through it and call us back in the future? Can do a lot to keep that emotion out of this system. It creates expectations about behavior. It defines who we are and what's important to us through a definition of values. So here we're talking about different policies and statements that can be really helpful if you put them together as a family. Managing the family's relationship to the business. So defining where socialism stops and where meritocracy and capitalism start up. Agreeing on the purpose, right? What's our goal here? What are we trying to accomplish together? Being able to talk very clearly about individual responsibilities and autonomy and group responsibilities. Creating predictable compensation and money models, especially as you get into the sibling and cousin generations. Talking through compensation and being as market-driven as possible with compensation models is so, so important. And then, as I just talked about, talking through family employment expectations. I mean, the real goal here, before I turn it back over to Otis for a minute, is to say we've created something special. We've created the golden goose, so to speak. And as long as the golden goose lays the golden egg, most of us are pretty happy about that. And as base as that might sound, I mean, we go into business in order to generate profit, in order to sustain the lifestyles and the goals that we want. It takes golden eggs. The greatest way to think about this and to communicate this to even young kids with such a simple analogy is to say, what we do is we think about protecting the golden goose, and that's the driving purpose here as we transition into a next generation of ownership and management. With that, I'll turn it back over to Otis.
Thanks, Dana. You know, I think it's important to look at some of the most common questions that families face, but also to acknowledge that every family is unique, and therefore the answers to these questions are not absolutely clear. They have to be worked out in your context of your family and your business. But you do need to start with what is most important to me, to my spouse. You and your spouse, particularly if you're the founder of the business or as a couple founders of the business, need to sort that out very clearly before you begin working with your children and your family. And then what do I want my legacy to be? Is this really destined to be a family business? Are you thinking about, wouldn't it be great if my grandchildren were running this business one day? Wouldn't it be wonderful if this great goose that's laying golden eggs was there to support our family and to enrich our family and encourage our family for generations to come? So if that's the case, then how do I deal fairly with my children? What is fair, after all? Is it fair to give some children cash and other children the business? But what if the business really does well, and therefore those who inherited the business end up with a great deal more than those who were given cash or other securities of some type? Sometimes I've seen parents who have given daughters, for example, real property, real estate, and sons an operating business, and seen the value of those two things change dramatically. Well, those children didn't feel they were dealt with fairly? So understanding what's fair gets to be an important question, and one you have to work out specifically for your family and your business. How should I manage family employment? And Dana just covered something that's a great example of what we call fair processes that all families need to develop, such as employment. But it's important to create fairness in the way the decision is made, the process, understanding that everyone won't be as accepting of a final decision every time. How much should I include in-laws in the family business? And there's no one right way or wrong way to do this. There are great examples of in-laws who have taken over family businesses and made them much more successful than they ever have been. But there are many examples of problems that have come through marriage relationships in families. And so every family has to work on that. And how much can I avoid conflict in our family business? You know, the reality there is we counsel all of our clients that you can't avoid conflict. Conflict is the predictable and natural outcome of people who are related to each other working in close proximity to each other. That happens. So the issue really becomes managing conflict in ways that help us to stay true to our family relationship and also responsible for our business. And how much information should I share? When should I share it? And with whom?
And now if we look at some of the most common ownership questions, so we'll just a logistical point here. So we're going to wrap up in about 5 minutes and encourage you to send in any kind of questions that you have for us. But hopefully as we're going through these questions in family and in ownership and then next in business, you can start to see some points of discussion that you can bring up with your co-owners, with your kids, with your spouse, with your parents to just move this conversation forward. I mean, it really is it's a difficult conversation to have for the reasons that we've talked about. But again, hopefully you can pick out some of these questions and put them in the right discussion forum and move things forward. For instance, what's the best model for planning for succession? There are different models that are out there, whether it's the 10 must-haves we've just gone through. There are really terrific books that have been written by John Ward and Craig Aronoff and others. You know, what's the best one that fits our culture and fits who we are? Should I give or sell my business to my kids? You know, we run into folks often, some who are advisors, who say the worst thing you can do is to give your business to your kids because they don't take the risk that you did. Others would say, well, of course they take risk. It's a family legacy risk that the controlling owners didn't start with. So it's an important question for you to consider. Should I pass shares equally to my kids, assets as well, as Otis just went through? Should I bring in outside board members? You know, Otis and I both have had a chance to work with John Ward, who is kind of a bit of a pioneer in our world, and Otis has worked with him for many, many years. I've had the privilege to do some work with him over the last couple of years, and one of the things that struck me about a question that he was asked in India last year by a group there was, what's the one thing that you've seen that's added more value to family business organizations than any other thing? And he said, outside board members, advisory board members, bringing in an objective approach and kind of creating this need for more professionalism. As uncomfortable it is, and we walk families through that process, the return on that investment of time and energy is significant, and I agree with them. How to deal with passive and active family owners? Tough question. If you're passing your business on to 2, 3, or 4, or 5, or 6 siblings or cousins, the chances are very good that one or more of them will be passive. And what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean they're on a boat somewhere cashing checks every month. It means that they're not actively involved in the day-to-day operations. But they might be very actively involved in decision-making at a board level. And what if our kids don't see eye to eye as business partners? Should one of them buy another one out? Should they have different fiefdoms that they're overseeing? Again, all based on the answer, you know, who are we as a family? What do we want? And how do we want to go forward? Business question. The question of, Otis, you want to take these? Go ahead.
Sure. I think these are really critical questions as well. Business questions get down to, how do I treat long-term employees fairly? That's very important because so often these folks are like family. Should family members be given preferential treatment? If we want to keep the business in the family and keep our family in the business, that's an important question to answer. How can I ensure talented managers in the next generation of our family? What's the best model for getting along as family employees? How do we keep harmony in our family? All of those are really very, very important. And how should I find and bring in talented non-family managers who will be as committed to this business as we are? And should I allow in-laws a chance to work in the company? These are all questions that must be answered in the family business.
In reality, there's two different things you can do with a family business. You can sell it to one or more outsiders who's going to run the business. Sell it for cash. That's rare. More often, you're going to have a structured payout over time. Mostly, we see between 5 and 10 years with 15 to 20% down and terms that kind of go from there. Or you're going to pass that on to family owners. And with those questions come some more specific questions. Who is going to run the ownership group? How is it going to be structured going forward? And in a case where children want to own the business, but maybe either don't want to operate or aren't the most talented operators, how then can we go out and find a non-family successor who is going to answer to a board as a responsible party for operating the assets? It's a very different model, one that we see, frankly, that does work successfully in many cases, but requires just as much open communication and fair process and hard work as the other option.
And I think that the result of all the takeaway here is that effective transitions depend on these things. First of all, understand that your success will depend upon your successor's success. And so it's important to plan and to help. Traditions that automatically handed the business to the eldest son have faded, and that needs to be set aside for the most capable person that can benefit the business and therefore everyone in an ownership position. It's also important to understand that an early designation reduces the risk that unexpected death or disability will leave the business drifting. Having a succession plan is really the responsibility of anyone currently leading the business. Openly considering all the potential candidates with a set of known criteria so everyone understands how the decision is being made in a rational and effective way, and prepare all stakeholders for success before the time comes. That's family members, non-family employees, that's customers, suppliers, everyone involved. Jennifer, do we have some questions that we need to deal with here?
Yes. So our first question is, how far out before I plan to retire should I start the planning process?
That's a great one. I'll jump in. One of the best organizations that I've dealt with at succession planning has been Caterpillar, which is heavy equipment manufacturers and distributors throughout the world. And when they talk with their distributors of their machines about succession planning, they give a 10-year to 12-year window. And in their opinion, and I've got to say, in a best-case scenario, I agree, if you've got 10 years to plan, you can do it excellently. Now, does that mean that everybody's got that much time? No, of course not. To do it really well, to go through the fair process that Otis talked about, and to make the plans and to identify the right timeline and to do things well, I'd say between 5 to 7 years is the best option. And it starts with determining on what day am I going to retire.
That's a very good point, Dana. You know, so many of my clients have said to me, but my children aren't old enough yet to really make a decision they want to be in the business. That's all right. You still have an obligation to have a succession plan in place. Now, that may be an interim plan that even a non-family employee could take up your role if something unfortunate happened that you were not able to continue. But the plan would be to develop children who are interested for the future. So that plan needs to be in place, even though it may change as your children grow and emerge in their own leadership ability.
Next, how do I ask my parents about their plans without sounding like I'm trying to push them out?
That's an excellent question. That's a tough one. My thought on that is you're right to know that that's a tricky question. And the great danger is that as soon as the question comes out of your mouth is that you're labeled as greedy and or impatient, right? So that's part of the art of this conversation is to know when to say, you know, Mom, Dad, I'm putting on my my ownership or my business hat. Let's put it that way. I'm going to put on a hat here, kind of metaphorically speaking, and I'd like to have a conversation with you that's going to feel uncomfortable, I think, and it's dangerous, and I want you to know I'm doing it out of a total respect and love for you and also trying to clarify my future. Can we have that kind of a conversation? You know, and it's important to think about where and when you're going to do that. If that's a Sunday afternoon after kind of a family dinner, or if it's at an event like a wedding or like a confirmation or a baptism or some sort of spiritual event. And then to say, you know, what are your plans for the future? And how do they include me and my siblings? And to just be careful, as you know, and to be as respectful as possible about it.
Thank you, Dana and Otis. We're at the end of our time. We want to thank all of our listeners for participating today, and we hope you will join us for our next webcast, Planning for Successful Succession.